Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Report with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington. Let's get to it. The House and Senate will both return Monday and stay in session through Thursday. Last week in the House came back on Monday and voted to pass two bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House took up and passed a rule governing floor consideration of a number of measures, including the Senate amendment to H.R. 7148, the government funding bill that had passed the Senate the previous week. The rule passed by the smallest margin possible, 217 to 215. All 217 votes for the measure came from the Republican side of the aisle. 214 of the 215 votes in opposition came from the Democrat side of the aisle. That's because no matter what the underlying measure, a vote on a rule is almost always a party line vote. Majority party discipline demands it be that way, and the duty of the opposition is to oppose. But then, 90 minutes later, the House met to vote on the government funding bill itself, and an interesting thing happened. Though the vote itself was almost identical, 217 to 214, the 217 votes in favor were cast by only 196 Republicans, with the addition of 21 Democrats. And the 214 votes in opposition were cast by 193 Democrats and 21 Republicans. So 21 Republican no votes were canceled out by exactly 21 Democrat aye votes. On Wednesday, the House took up and passed H.R. 4090, the Critical Minerals Dominance Act, by a vote of 224 to 195. Then the House took up and passed H.J. Res. 142, disapproving the action of the District of Columbia Council in approving the D.C. Income and Franchise Tax Conformity and Revision Temporary Amendment Act of 2026. That was an action by the District of Columbia Council that effectively canceled many of the tax benefits of the Working Families Tax Cut Act from last year. So the House took action to disapprove that action, as is its right. In fact, the Congress has until February 23rd, 2026 to block that D.C. Council legislation from taking effect. And then they were done. This week in the House is scheduled to come back Monday with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m. At that time, the House is scheduled to consider 7 bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday and for the balance of the week, the House will consider 4 bills pursuant to a rule. They are H.R. 261, the Underseas Cable Protection Act, H.R. 2189, the Law Enforcement Innovate to De-Escalate Act, H.R. 3617, the Securing America's Critical Minerals Supply Act, and S. 1383, the Save America Act, as amended. And, of course, if negotiations conclude in time, the House will also take up a Department of Homeland Security funding bill. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Last week in the Senate came back on Monday and voted to end debate on the nomination of Donald Clay Fowlkes to serve as a U.S. District Judge for the Western District of Arkansas. On Tuesday, the Senate voted to confirm him to that position. Then the Senate voted to end debate on and then to confirm the nomination of John Gangai to serve as a U.S. District Judge for the Southern District of Texas. Then the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of Aaron Christian Peterson to serve as a U.S. District Judge for the District of Alaska. On Wednesday, the Senate voted to confirm him to that position. Then the Senate voted to end debate on and then to confirm the nomination of Blair Benton to serve as U.S. District Judge for the Western District of Missouri. And then the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of Brian Charles Leah to serve as a U.S. District Judge for the Western District of Tennessee. On Thursday, the Senate voted to confirm him to that position. Then the Senate voted to end debate on and then to confirm the nomination of Justin R. Olson to serve as a U.S. District Judge for the Southern District of Indiana. And then they were done. This week in the Senate will return Monday with the first vote scheduled for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote on a motion to end debate on the nomination of Daniel E. Burrows to serve as an Assistant Attorney General. And if negotiations conclude in time, the Senate will also take up a Department of Homeland Security funding bill. We'll talk more about that in a moment. First, let's talk about election law. If you're a longtime consumer of Tea Party Patriots Action's Washington Report, you'll remember the SAVE Act, that is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. That's a bill that fixes a problem in the National Voter Registration Act, also known as the Motor Voter Bill, which became law in 1993 under President Bill Clinton, and required states to make available at their Department of Motor Vehicles and other state offices the paperwork necessary to register people to vote. The thinking on that bill was simple. The DMV was a place that lots of people went to engage with state government. So why not take advantage of the fact that they're already there and make sure they're registered to vote? And if they're not registered, make it easy for them to register right there without having to go to another office in some other location. The NVRA called for the establishment of a national voter registration form. The first question on that form is a simple yes or no question. Are you a citizen of the United States? And you check the box. And if you check no, then you are directed to stop filling out the form. Well, that sounds reasonable, but it leaves open the possibility that someone who is not a citizen could inadvertently rush through filling out the form and not realize they've made a mistake in checking the yes answer when they should have checked the no box. Now, there's no requirement that a would-be voter show proof of citizenship. All the form requires is an attestation to that effect. Well, that leaves the door open for mistakes, and it leaves the door open for fraud. Worse, it turns out, the bigger problem is that the way the legislation was written, the Supreme Court has interpreted it to mean that states cannot require a stricter standard, that is, documentary proof of citizenship. So lawmakers seek to remedy that problem by creating the SAVE Act, which specifically amends the National Voter Registration Act to require documentary proof of citizenship before a would-be voter is allowed to register to vote. That bill passed the House last April on a bipartisan basis, but was lost in the Senate. Now it's been revised to add a photo ID requirement for voting. That is, it still maintains the requirement for documentary proof of citizenship before allowing a would-be voter to register to vote, but it adds a requirement that when voting, a photo ID must be presented to verify that the voter is in question, is in fact who he or she says he or she is. The revised bill also eliminates mail-in registration and mandates that states take new steps to remove non-citizens from existing voter rolls. Conservatives in the House are confident they can pass the bill through the House. It's the Senate that's the problem. The first stab at a solution was to demand last week that the bill be attached as a sidecar to the funding bill, a must-pass piece of legislation. Speaker Johnson promised them he would find another way to send it to the Senate in a manner designed to defeat a Democrat filibuster on the motion to proceed, and they relented and accepted his promise of a vote this week on another vehicle. So the bill, as revised and retitled, it's now called the Save America Act, as suggested by President Trump, will come to the floor of the House most likely on Wednesday, and it will likely pass. But then it goes to the Senate, and its fate there is uncertain. Speaker Johnson has said he wants to use a Senate vehicle to carry the bill. That is, he may offer it procedurally as an amendment to a bill that's already passed the Senate, so that when it passes and goes back to the Senate, Leader Thune has one fewer procedural step that he has to take to get the bill on the floor. Some senators, including Utah's Mike Lee, Florida's Rick Scott, and Wisconsin's Ron Johnson, have been talking about going back to what's called a standing filibuster or a talking filibuster, like what you've all seen in the Frank Capra movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, when the freshman senator, played by Jimmy Stewart, holds the Senate floor so long that he drops to the floor of exhaustion. For the most part, we don't do that kind of filibuster anymore. And these senators believe that if they can force the Democrats to engage in the standing filibuster, rather than simply telling the majority leader they will oppose the motion to proceed or a motion to end debate, so he shouldn't even bother to take up the Senate's time with a floor vote on the matter, then they can run out the clock on the Democrats, and eventually they'll be able to call the question, and it will go before the body on a simple majority vote threshold. And because there are 53 GOP senators, they will win with a simple majority vote, and that'll be that. You can read online explanations of how this would work. It's actually rather complicated. Under the rules of the Senate, each senator is allowed to speak in a debate only twice in the same legislative day. So, as long as the Senate GOP maintains a quorum on the floor of the Senate, that's a simple majority, which is 51 senators, they can make the Democrats run out the clock. But if anyone successfully offers an amendment, then a new debate begins, debate on the amendment. And that means 47 Democrat senators each get the opportunity to speak twice on the new issue of conflict. And, well, you can see it can take an awful lot of floor time, which is the most valuable thing in the Senate. I'm not sure there are 51 senators in the majority who are up for the effort required. So we'll keep our eye on this when it gets to the Senate. Now let's talk about the Clintons and the Epstein files. Bill and Hillary Clinton caved and will testify in private before the House Oversight Committee. Now they're complaining that the committee intends to videotape their depositions. I can't tell you that I understand their objection. The committee has made clear in all its correspondence with the Clintons' lawyers that their testimony will be videotaped, just as all such testimony is videotaped. Anyway, the big takeaway here is that we didn't have votes last week to hold the Clintons in criminal contempt of Congress. All right, now let's talk about government funding, meaning DHS funding. When Congress came back in session Monday last week, the government was partially shut down. Major departments and agencies like the Defense Department, the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, Labor, HHS, Transportation, and HUD, and all their sub-agencies like the Transportation Safety Administration and the Federal Emergency Management Administration were all shut down. The government funding bill that had passed the Senate Friday night, just a few hours before the midnight funding deadline, and the House had not been in session to pass the amended bill and get it to the president's desk for his signature. So those portions of the government that were funded in that bill were still waiting for a House vote to clear the measure. But no one was confident that Speaker Johnson would be able to maneuver the bill through the House to passage. For one thing, House conservatives didn't like the bill. They didn't like the idea that Democrats seemed to be winning on the funding fight, even though they were in the minority in both houses. How did that work? What was the point of owning the majority if the minority was going to be determining policy? So they made some threatening noises. Then there was Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, who was determined to move the SAVE Act, the bill we were just talking about. She knew it would be nearly impossible to get the Senate to move on that bill, and it needed 60 votes to break a Senate filibuster, so she was talking about insisting that Speaker Johnson add the SAVE Act to the amended government funding bill, since it was a must-pass bill. And you'll recall from our last conversation that Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries had surprised Speaker Johnson and everyone else when he announced a week ago Saturday that House Democrats didn't feel obliged to vote for the funding measure because he hadn't been part of those negotiations and he hadn't made any promises. And, in fact, Democrats would vote against the funding package. So on Monday, when Congress got back into session, it looked like the mountain in front of Speaker Johnson was a virtual Everest of obstacles that he was going to have to summit. In the end, there was very little drama. A meeting here, a conversation there, and he held his conference together on the rule vote, and then 90 minutes later, he got what he needed on the vote for the full package. So he passed 5 bills to fully fund those departments of government: Defense, State, Transportation, HUD, HHS, labor, education, all the way through to the end of the fiscal year in September. And he bought 2 weeks' time to conduct negotiations over DHS funding. That deadline expires Friday, February 13th. That's Friday, just 4 days from now. They still have not come to agreement on a DHS funding deal. That's because the Democrats have not made serious proposals. On Wednesday, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer joined House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries in releasing to the press a list of 10 demands for DHS reforms. They are, and I'm quoting, number 1, targeted enforcement. DHS officers cannot enter private property without a judicial warrant. End indiscriminate arrests and improve warrant procedures and standards. Require certification that a person is not a U.S. citizen before holding them in immigration detention. Number 2, no masks. Prohibit ICE and immigration enforcement agents from wearing face coverings. Number 3, require ID. Require DHS officers conducting immigration enforcement to display their agency, unique ID number, and last name. Require them to verbalize their ID number and last name if asked. Number 4, protect sensitive locations. Prohibit funds from being used to conduct enforcement near sensitive locations, including medical facilities, schools, child care facilities, churches, polling places, courts, etc. Number 5, stop racial profiling. Prohibit DHS officers from conducting stops, questioning, and searches based on an individual's presence at certain locations, their job, their spoken language, and accent, or their race and ethnicity. Number 6, uphold use of force standards. Place into law a reasonable use of force policy, expand training and require certifications of officers. In the case of an incident, the officer must be removed from the field until an investigation is conducted. Number 7, ensure state and local coordination and oversight. Preserve the ability of state and local jurisdictions to investigate and prosecute potential crimes and use of excessive force incidents. Require that evidence is preserved and shared with jurisdictions. Require the consent of states and localities to conduct large-scale operations outside of targeted immigration enforcement. Number 8, build safeguards into the system. Make clear that all buildings where people are detained must abide by the same basic detention standards that require immediate access to a person's attorney to prevent citizen arrests or detention. Allow states to sue DHS for violations of all requirements. Prohibit limitations on member visits, that is, member of Congress visits, to ICE facilities, regardless of how those facilities are funded. Number 9, body cameras for accountability, not tracking. Require use of body-worn cameras when interacting with the Republic and mandate requirements for the storage and access of footage. Prohibit tracking, creating, or maintaining databases of individuals participating in First Amendment activities. And finally, number 10, no paramilitary police. Regulate and standardize the type of uniforms and equipment DHS officers carry during enforcement operations to bring them in line with civil enforcement. Alabama Republican Senator Caney Britt, who serves as chairman of the Homeland Security Subcommittee of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and who has, as a consequence, been tapped by Senate Majority Leader John Thune to lead the negotiations over the DHS funding bill for Senate Republicans, responded to that list of demands simply and forcefully. Quote, Democrats have given us a Christmas list of demands for the press. This is not negotiating in good faith, and it's not what the American people want. They continue to play politics to their radical base at the expense of the safety of Americans. DHS, FEMA, Secret Service, and the Coast Guard run out of money in 9 days. Democrats don't seem to care one bit. So at this writing, we're stuck, and we have no idea how or when the DHS funding problem is going to be solved. There are a few options for congressional leaders. Leader Thune has suggested that if he believes the negotiations are on track and just need more time to finalize, he'd consider putting a short-term continuing resolution for DHS funding on the floor. Or he could put a year-long continuing resolution on the floor just for the Department of Homeland Security and dare the Democrats to vote against it. I think that's exactly what the Democrats want. They want to play to their radicalized base. They want to be seen as shutting down immigration and customs enforcement entirely. The problem, of course, is that in order to shut down ICE, you have to shut down all of DHS, and that means you're shutting down 22 different component agencies of DHS, which employ more than 260,000 people. You're shutting down Customs and Border Protection, and FEMA, and TSA, and the Coast Guard, and the Secret Service. But Democrats appear to be willing to pay whatever small price they pay for having shut down those other agencies in exchange for the bonus public relations boost they think they'll receive for being the ones who shut down ICE. So Democrats have very little incentive to move off their radical position. In their minds, it's a win-win. They win if Republicans give in to their demands, and they win if Republicans refuse to give in. On Sunday afternoon, Senate Democrats sent the majority the legislative language for their demands. Under normal circumstances, that would be taken as a good sign. When legislators actually have legislative text in front of them, they can start bargaining. But these are not normal times, as we've just reviewed. I just don't see a high likelihood that either side is going to be able to come to agreement on a full DHS funding bill by Friday. That means the Senate is going to have to tee up and pass a continuing resolution for DHS funding by Wednesday. So there will be enough time to get it over to the House in time for a vote Thursday before everyone leaves town for the President's Day recess and, more importantly, the Munich Security Conference. And the Munich Security Conference is key to this whole thing, believe it or not, because Congress only acts when there's a forcing mechanism. And the forcing mechanism this week is this. If any part of the government is shut down, even temporarily, there are no CODELs, that's congressional delegations, flying anywhere around the world. And the Munich Security Conference is a big, big deal for lots and lots of senators. So they've got to have the government funded, at least on a continuing resolution basis, so they can go to Munich. Don't kill the messenger if you don't like the message. I can't help it that the prospect of a trip to the Munich Security Conference is the forcing mechanism that will work to keep the government fully funded for another couple of weeks. I'm just here to report to you on the way things really work in Washington. Now, one final miscellaneous matter. For any of you who watched the Super Bowl halftime show last night with Bad Bunny, and you saw him at some point hand a Grammy Award to a small boy, that boy was not the 5-year-old boy who was detained by ICE. There was some questioning of that on X last night. I just wanted to clear that up for anyone who was wondering. And that's where we sit today as members of the House come back to Washington. What was originally planned as a vote for tonight has now been moved to tomorrow at the earliest. And more than half the government did remain shut down until Speaker Johnson figured out how to get that bill through the House. That's our Washington report for this week. If you've got any questions or comments, please drop us a line at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. If you want me to answer a question during the broadcast, just put "for broadcast" in the subject line. We'll be back next week with another edition of the Washington Report. It may not be the same time and the same channel because next Monday is President's Day. Not sure whether we'll be doing the Washington Report on Monday or Tuesday, but either way, you'll get a new Washington Report next week. Until then, be well and be active.